Welcome back to the DATAMIND podcast. Today, we're delighted to welcome Professor Dan Joyce from the University of Liverpool. Dan is a psychiatrist and a data scientist who has been pioneering the integration of AI in mental health, while keeping a pragmatic view on how it will be of use to clinicians in the real world. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Marcus.
Here in Swansea. So before we dive in, can you please share us a little bit about your journey? I mean, we just mentioned both psychiatrist and data scientist. I mean, you really took the two ends of the spectrum here and brought them together. So how did that happen?
I think your introduction was very generous. I think lots of uses of words like pioneer, but and I'm not entirely sure I can back that up. But there's a kind of joke about what data science is. It's either a computer scientist who knows a little bit of statistics but not nearly enough to be a statistician, or a statistician that knows enough coding to be kind of an approximation to a computer scientist. So with that in mind, I use that term sort of data science because it best captures the sort of pragmatic approach to using data in useful and informative ways, rather than just kind of, certainly not a statistician, right? For absolute clarity, and very interested in the use of computational methods to solve problems that present themselves in medicine and in my field, psychiatry specifically. So it seems like an obvious marriage of the two things. And I came at this from originally being a computer scientist, right? And then sort of having a mid-career crisis and thinking, I don't want to spend all my time sat in front of a computer all day writing code. And of course, the irony now is that I don't get to spend enough time doing that. So that's the kind of fun part of the gig now. But yeah, then I trained as a psychiatrist. And then, as you say, most recently, I moved to work with my colleagues at the University of Liverpool, where we've got a bunch of programs around mental health and how we might do better with leveraging primarily data, but a big part of the MRIC project, the Mental Health Research for Innovation Centre, a sort of a cross-cutting theme through that is actionable data. It's how we take data, make it more valuable for both patients and for clinicians so that we can improve mental health care. But we're certainly not the first people to propose that as an idea, just to be clear. But we're very much focusing on the actionable end of it. So rather than kind of more moonshot type projects, we kind of focus on things that we could presumably translate into a clinical setting, quite quickly, and where those benefits would be obvious to the patient and clinician also quite quickly. So not with a 10 or 15 year horizon, stuff that we can do here and now that might make a difference in a few weeks' time if we could use those tools.
That is really interesting, because I'm thinking now, as someone that only wears one of those hats, which is the data science one, if you want, I guess even if I want to think of, okay, what can we do now just on my own? What can we do now to actually, have a very direct impact to patients? I guess I'm missing that other part, which is on a level is the beauty of what I can do, which is like, I get to work with a lot of other people that have that expertise that I don't have. But I imagine for you, you are definitely in a privileged position in the sense that you kind of see both worlds, right? You can have a look at the problem through both lenses at the same time, and I guess that must be really, really interesting.
Should point out, I really should. I've always had I've always been lucky enough to be sort of a jack of all trades, but certainly master of none, right? So I'm quite rusty on a lot of things that a first-year undergrad computer scientist would take for granted. So I'm not going to put myself in a position of being expert on these things at all. But it would depend on your perspective, I guess. But the thing that always struck me when I was training as a psychiatrist after med school and the kind of junior doctor years was looking through that lens of computational method, which I think is a really discrete set of intellectual skills. It's a real toolkit that enables you to carve the world at its joints, so to speak, for better or worse, right? But it's certainly one way of looking at problems. And I think it's probably familiar to a lot of engineering colleagues as well. I think there is a certain kind of shared mindset. I do think it is helpful because it exposes things that you might not see otherwise. So we've talked about this a lot, in our discussions previously, Marcos, but one of the things that kind of interests me is how you can look for ways of solving problems by fundamentally, pulling them apart into smaller components and trying to solve the smaller components. Now, some people call that reductionism, and they use the term reductionism as a pejorative, right? Yeah. I don't see it that way. I actually see that it's probably one of the most useful human intellectual attributes, right? Is the ability to take a problem and pull it apart. And by solving the smaller problems, you might actually get some distance towards solving a larger one. So that for me was always a kind of interesting way of looking at it. I guess another angle that's always struck me as fascinating about looking at problems in clinical context through that kind of computational lens is sometimes it allows you to see, or it allows you to build like a pipeline or a flow chart, or you can articulate a system of boxes and pipes, and that for me is a really powerful way of looking at it. So we, in our previous discussion, we talked for hours and hours about diagnosis and the process of diagnosis. And, when we were talking, we were drawing lots of boxes and arrows and saying, that's why this is there and this happens in this way. So by no means suggesting it's a panacea or it's the only way of looking at the problem, but it does, I think, give you a different perspective on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I find that really interesting what you just said, like in terms of the fact that that data science training allows you to just break the problem into smaller chunks, because that is what I think it's like the programmer's way of thinking, which is what I tell my students when they are learning how to program. Is like, right, so the first thing you need to learn is how to think like a programmer. And it's really interesting. I didn't realize until later on that I had to start teaching this, that actually is not a common, like people don't think in those terms often. Like they don't realize, right? Even like with the mundane things like, brushing your teeth. It's like all the things that are implied in the process of just brushing your teeth. And you're absolutely right that it's definitely a different lens, therefore, when you bring that to a field like mental health. So yeah, really cool. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that you have wrote. One of them is AI and big data. And you have a blog where you talk about the hype surrounding big data and AI in psychiatry. So if you can walk us through about some common misconceptions about, what are the advantages of having access to massive data sets, but also what are some potential disadvantages?
Right, yeah. I think you're talking about a blog that I wrote a few years back. And for context, it was a colleague of mine who said that they trying to carefully say so they're embarrassing. Basically, they emailed and said, "Have you got any thoughts on this topic?" Because I need to go and speak to some people about it. And I was like, I've got many thoughts about it. So I started writing, an email and just thought, I'll just turn it into a blog. And I'm dreadful at writing, so I thought it would be a good exercise to try and learn how to write more quickly, more efficiently. I just thought I'd try and improve that skill. But that's where it came from. And what it was for a few years now, both as a clinician, so as a jobbing clinician where you go into a busy clinical setting, you've got a lot of work to do. We use electronic health records as it's almost too much of a centerpiece of our work at times, but it is the reality of practicing. So I'm busy writing and reading lots of stuff in EHR, electronic health records. And then the other part of my job, I'm kind of thinking, like we were just describing, is how am I going to parse all of this data in some way that means I can extract actionable insights, things that I can use in the real world to help, my colleague clinicians do their jobs better. And of course, the only reason for doing that is to try and help patients, get the access to the right treatments or to get better. And it occurred to me that there was a lot of enthusiasm. This was some years back, right? I mean, it was sort of nearly a decade ago. People were very enthused about the idea that electronic health records were some magical repository, of all the clinical data you could ever want, and that if we could just find we could just crack the code, or we could find the magic source to sort of sprinkle on it, that we would somehow unlock this rich, like there'd be a tsunami of insights from this data that we didn't have previously. And I couldn't marry those two, because when I was reading. When I was working with a patient and reading their records, I was just scrolling through all of this noise and just thinking, has someone written something I can use? Where is the actionable insight here? And very often, we would sit with the EHR and you control F and then type keywords you wanted to look for, right? And I just thought, I can't reconcile how my colleagues who work in, for example, natural language processing and engineers and all these really, really smart people that I'm lucky enough to have as colleagues, they're really enthusiastic about this. And I kind of can be drawn into that very quickly. And then I go back to, if you like, my day job, and I'm just like frustrated because I'm having to search through tons and tons of text trying to find anything that would tell me or give me the information that I needed. So I couldn't reconcile the two. And that led me to think about some assumptions that I think are baked in to work we do with, particularly with natural language processing and electronic health records. And one of them that occurred to me was when you look at the strategy for how we might, in the NHS, the strategy that we think we might use to arrive at a data repository that's available nationally, there seemed to be this assumption that the sum of all EHRs is as good as a registry, a national registry. So the kinds of national registries that you see in the Scandinavian countries. And it occurred to me, well, I don't think that's true. I'll articulate the reasons in a mo, but that didn't strike me as true. And the other thing that struck me as, and again, back to our point about thinking like a computer scientist, is the more you want to harmonize data from two different sources, you very often have to convert that data into a common currency, so you can't have people using one word for a diagnosis in one EHR and a different word in a different one. So you have to harmonize, and to harmonize, you have to abstract. So you go up from the detail to a layer of abstraction above, which gifts you the ability to map two concepts between different EHRs. But then you've got to do that abstraction again if you want to produce data that a different level of abstraction, or you want to do some more harmonization. And it occurred to me, the more you kind of aggregate and abstract, the less and less useful the data becomes, because what you end up with is just a summary of people that happen to live in the United Kingdom, right? I mean, these things sort of kept me awake at night. Where we kind of, I think where we've landed nowadays is the idea that there's no, I don't think electronic health record data can ever be it can get you so far, but if and only if you focus on the limitation, there's an upper bound I think you can get from EHRs. And what I mean by that is when you look at a note, a single entry on an electronic health record for a patient, what you're looking at is an artifact of a huge, complex and undocumented cognitive and clinical process that results in the artifact that you're looking at, right? So to give you an example, if I wrote a note if I write something in a patient's notes that summarizes, a multidisciplinary team where there's been disagreement about a diagnosis, for example, or disagreement about a treatment plan, what you're reading in the EHR is the artifact of 5, 6, 7 people sat in a room, all put in different positions, arguing, and finally arriving, and sometimes begrudgingly arriving at a treatment plan that is not by no means perfect. So what you're seeing is an artifact that only reflects the culture of practice around the group of clinicians that actually put that data there. What it's absent is any description of the data that team were using to make that decision. So you've got an artifact, which completely obscures the process an MDT making decisions and has no record of the data that they were using in order to make that decision. So I've for a long time felt that EHR data is an artifact of a complex series of systems and processes. Yeah. And if you don't factor that in, you don't account for what is fundamentally a really strong bias in electronic health record data. And this is pure anecdote, I should point out. But when I read, EHR data, and when we've done slightly more scientifically projects where we've tried to annotate electronic health record data, we've noticed that that artifact contains lots of positive examples of things. So almost as if some of that data just reflects what the clinicians had already decided. Yeah. So someone, for example, that you decide that their diagnosis is of bipolar affective disorder. Well, it contains all the artifact of that process that supports that conclusion. Yeah. But it contains none of the data that you might have argued about in the room, which is, but there's no evidence they've ever had this, or they've never been admitted to hospital for that. So you don't see any of that. So back to your question, and I apologize for making a very circuitous route to it, but if you imagine that you can then give that data, to an algorithm, fundamentally, these are computational processes or algorithms, and that it can magically infer all of that process, all of the culture of practice, and all of the biases that have seeped into that artifact. I just think that's a bit wrong-headed. I don't know how you could ever do that. And I remember, I think that the biostatistician Frank Carell said that, you can only go so far with observational data because all it really records is what happened at that hospital. It doesn't record anything else, right? So it doesn't record, like we said, the factors that positively sway you towards one thing or away for another. It is not an unbiased data sample in any sense. So I'm curious about what we can do, given that means that EHR data is not going to magically spring forth a tsunami of insights at a statistical or an epidemiological level. The question really is how can we leverage, for example, a local EHR that's working for a local group of clinicians? How can we leverage that data to make their jobs easier or make them more informed about the decisions that they're making clinically? So it's much more about actionable insights, accepting that the data is imperfect, and then maybe even using that insight to think about how we might collect better data in the first place rather than relying on, these noisy artifactual sources.
So do you think, just following up on that, do you think then which way, I guess an answer could be both of them, but you have mentioned now that there's two ways that we can address this. One is we work with the data, we understand the limitations of the data. By the way, I like the fact, because we have been saying that as well. It's like, look, the data, it's full of biases for various reasons. At the same time, I like the fact that you're pointing that out, but you're still saying we can use it, but we need to be aware of. It's just a matter of being aware of. You're not saying, oh, let's not use it, and then we're throwing away expressing the baby with the water or something like that. Right? Yeah. So on the one hand is we can build better models that are that account for those biases. At the same time, we can record better data. How do you think we should balance the efforts here?
Right. Yeah. That's a question that invites strong opinions. So
yeah.
with recognition that this is just my opinion
Yes.
on it. I do think, and I'll restrict it to the very specific area I work in. So in psychiatry, I think there are, and again through a sort of a computational lens, I think there is probably a lot more we can do to collect meaningful, actionable data about patients' experiences that we can use in quite narrow, tight feedback loops to benefit the patient quite quickly. Yeah, I think I have to be honest, I think investing in that is probably not a bad idea. It's finding how we can use technology and data better to benefit patients in the short term. I probably would, very opinionated view again, but I think if we persist with the idea that this tsunami of insights will be sprung forth with just the right magic sauce, I don't think is long term. I just don't think is viable, and I think it kind of distracts us from the real problem, which is everything we talked about. This notion of an EHR, an entry on an electronic health record, being an artifact of. I mean, if only there was a science dedicated to the study of that. So you've got measurement theory, right, which kind of tries to explain that. You've got epidemiologists and statisticians who have written volumes about this. For the best part of a century. So there's plenty of people thinking about this problem much more carefully. And it's probably worth pausing and paying attention to that, I think, and then thinking about what would be the things you should invest time, energy, and technology in to make the lives of patients better. And I'm not 100% sold that aggregating together all the EHR data is the way to do that.
So I know you said that it was just your opinion, but I have to say that what you just said, it's perfectly in line aligns perfectly with what I have heard patients saying. One of the things, like actually the SRAC, the Super Research Advisory Group from DATAMIND, one of the things that they have mentioned a couple of times is when we talk about clinical notes, is that okay, but where is the context of my life? So where is all the information around the fact that I feel like this today? Like, why do I feel, it's not just that I feel this way, it's what has brought me to feel this way today. And I think that is a little bit about what you were saying, like probably the patient told them, but the clinician just wrote is the artifact.
No evidence of, or strong evidence for, That's fascinating to hear. So that was from your patient advisory group in DATAMIND.
DATAMIND, yes.
So if I can just give a bit of a shout out to the Emmerich patient advisory group. So we don't call them the patient advisory group, but it's the same function. It's a group of people who are experts by experience who come and co-design and tell us how we should go about doing good research. That's exactly the same messaging. It's to speak to your point, it's we really don't mind lending you our data to try and solve problems, but you have to persuade us that the problems are worth solving, and importantly that you account for the context of our lives in how that data is produced. And the thing we hear time and time again is, you do know that a lot of what's written in my notes, as in if I was speaking as one of our experts by experience, they say what's written in my notes, I can tell you, is not accurate or reliable, or what you and I, Marcos, would describe as it contains substantial bias.
Yes.
Okay. As far as the patients that I've spoken with have said, is it very often contains not only bias, but they're very aware that it's artifactual. It strips away some context. And the third point that I don't know if you've heard it from the DATAMIND folks, but from our groups, our expert by experience groups, we strongly hear this. It's like, we have no beef with exploring the uses of technology to improve healthcare. But what we really want to do is do that so that it frees up more time for relational care. So we actually have that contact with a real human healthcare professional. So it's like, if you're doing this so that you can get rid of proper face-to-face contact with a professional, we're not supporting that, right? But if what you're doing is in order to make best use of that limited time, if you like, that golden hour of time with a clinician, then by all means, fill your boots. So that's the messaging that we're getting from our groups. And it's not, I guess it's not actually surprising that you're getting the same message. But I mean, you repeat that experiment all around the country with different groups of people from different areas who are all involved in kind of co-production of research with patient bodies, then my guess is that we probably would hear that. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. More data is always better. Is that true?
Yeah, it's patently untrue, right? So that's the opinionated version. So back to our discussion about artifact. It's the idea that there's an interaction with the patient, and then that there's some capture of information, which might be codified as data, which goes through a complex process, is influenced by the culture of the team and all of that stuff. And then what you end up with in the actual data that you and I have access to as when we're working at it as researchers is only an artifact. It doesn't represent all of the process. So there's a sort of model for that in and again, not a statistician, right? But my reading of this really great paper by Meng from memory, I think it's 2018, 2019, but it's called The Big Data Paradox. And for me, it changed my view of the world. It's such a powerfully written paper. But essentially, the analogy is if you treat that artifact in the EHR, as a response to a survey, well, Meng's work was on surveys, and it's how do you go from the opinion of people in the population, say, their polling preferences, to the result of what they vote in a survey, what they report to you in a survey. So using sort of survey methodology, he explained the big data paradox. And I just think it's a perfect metaphor for EHRs. So the big data paradox says that essentially, just because you get more data, you could end up in a scenario where you amplify the noise in that data so that any estimate derived from that data becomes has more variance or more variability and less certainty on it. And it was put to really, really good use. The example that I remember we talked about it earlier, so I pulled it up, but there's this really great example of it. There was a paper by Bradley et al. In 2021 where they looked at if you took a well-designed, so you got a team of proper epidemiologists and survey methodologists to design a really good survey. And you were to use that survey to ask people, are you going to take the COVID vaccine? And then you compared it later on, you compared that survey result. So you estimate that, let's say, 72% of people will take the vaccine on the basis of this survey. And then, of course, you'll collect that data as the vaccine was rolled out, and you can compare it. So you can see what the error was from your survey to what the actual uptake was. And I've got the numbers here because I can never remember them right. But what they did is they used Meng's big data paradox, and they implemented some clever ways of estimating. In Meng's original paper, there's a sort of 3-component formula that decomposes the error in an estimate of a population mean, right? So here we're talking about, let's assume that 59% of people did take up the vaccine in its first phase. So if you estimate that 72% took it from a survey, then of course you've got an error, the difference between 72 and 59%. So what Bradley did was they took 3, and I'm sorry I have to read it off the slide, but it's such a staggering number that I've got to get it right. So they took a well-designed survey, a probabilistic survey of 1,000 people, and used that to estimate the number of people that would take up the vaccine. Mm-hmm. They used another survey which was not as rigorously defined, but had about 75,000 people in it. Then they took some survey data from Facebook, which had 250,000 people in it. Now, I don't know about you, but when I did, Biostats 101 as a student, it was like bigger N equals good. And we kind of inculcated, certainly at med school, that was, the bigger the sample size, the more reliable it is, and you just assume because the formula for, just about every measure of dispersion has kind of N on the denominator or square root of N on the denominator. Yeah. You sort of assume the bigger the N gets, the smaller your uncertainty on the estimate gets. But what the Bradley showed, and I'm just going to read the quote from the paper because it's staggering. So if you take the unselected, completely just, self-selecting Facebook survey of 250,000 people, and use that to estimate vaccine uptake, right? The result versus the 1,000 people in the properly designed survey, you find this, and this is a direct quote from the paper, right? A survey of 250,000 respondents can produce an estimate of the population mean that is no more accurate than an estimate from a simple random sample of size 10. So if
wow.
Isn't that amazing? So if basically you try and eliminate those processes that lead to the artifact as we've been describing in EHRs, right? What that shows you is that small small, highly, that's not the right word, a small sample size, yeah, but properly designed so that you're measuring the thing that you want to measure,
Right.
yeah, gives you a way better estimate than a poorly designed measurement system, even though it gives you a much larger number. That to me was absolutely staggering. And if you've not read Bradley's paper, strongly recommend reading it, because it's just mind blowing just how all of those assumptions that having a large sample size is a good thing. And just to convert it back to the metaphor, I think that's what we mean about when we talked earlier about the sum of EHRs is not necessarily going to be that useful, because you're not accounting for the processes, the measurement error, yeah, or the measurement mechanism that leads to the artifact. So if you're using the artifact alone with no account, yeah, I think Meng's big data paradox translates, not perfectly, but it's a good metaphor for what's going on.
Yeah, so
EHRs.
So I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe one line is, yes, N is, I think a large N is better only if the say the error is random. If the noise is random, then when you average, you get rid of the noise. But when it's not random, like the example you're talking about now with the electronic health records, where it's maybe culture and therefore all the errors go towards on the same direction, then larger N, it's only going to confirm the bias. That's all.
Yeah, the errors will compound, right? I mean, presumably,
exactly. That's the word.
A bit like kind of the way, I'm sort of faintly recalling it from doing A-level physics, but the other sort of systematic error kind of compounds as you go through the measurement process. And it usually in a multiplicative fashion, right? So it just gets worse and worse by orders of magnitude quite quickly. And I hope I've made that metaphor. It's not a perfect metaphor, but it feels like a metaphor that applies to EHRs, because, like we've said, you've got all this unmeasured complexity. So, and what you're looking at when you're looking at an entry in an electronic health record is not necessarily, it's not a well measured set of data. It's not a data point that's been measured precisely. It's just the product of all those processes. So it seems to me like an apt metaphor.
And I guess just to reiterate that you're not saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that we shouldn't be using the data. It's just that if you have a lot of data, yes, use it, but you need to be aware of where the biases are so that then you can properly interpret the results. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I can give you a really if you don't mind.
Go ahead, please.
So something that's been vexing the team of folks that I work with is we were looking at one of our electronic health record data, and it's a mental health EHR, and one of my colleagues, a very expert data scientist and statistician, so said, I can't work this out. How do you explain to me that you guys aren't recording primary diagnoses for patients? And I said, what do the numbers look like? And I think we started off, he's going to be very upset with me if I misquote, but we started off, I think he said it's like 30% of patients have an ICD-10 diagnosis for their primary diagnosis. He said, what happened to the other 70%? And I remember sort of thinking, I've used these systems and I've worked in different healthcare teams and so on, and I can kind of see that. And he was like, really? Yeah. And we actually did some more work on the data, and I think we got it down. It's now down to 7%. And it was like, how can that possibly be true? And this data is fundamentally redundant in that case. And then I went back to the NHS trust that produced the data and asked them about, what are the rules? And they told me very clearly, and this is from their informatics team. They said, oh, look, it's really simple to explain. We only insist that if you're admitted to hospital, you must have a primary ICD-10 code. Yeah, otherwise you can't press the discharge button on the EHR. Yeah. And I said, what about community? And they said, oh, we don't make that. That rule doesn't apply to community teams. Now, 96% of mental health care occurs in the community and only 4% inpatient. Yeah. So now right? That's the mechanism by which that diagnostic coding data, is almost entirely explained by just understanding that process, that measurement process, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of disappointing if you're a data scientist or an epidemiologist or a statistician. I mean, that's not missing at random, right? That's almost like belligerently, systematically missing. But you need to understand that. So, you could conclude one of two things, right? Either those clinicians have no idea. For 93% of the patients, they've got no idea what's going on. Yeah, that would be one assumption to draw from it. Or if you know the culture of practice around it, you understand that there's a very good reason why only 7% of patients have that ICD-10 primary code. So yeah, it just goes back to the point. You need to know the measurement process for the thing you're looking at.
And I guess in line with that, but going back to something you mentioned, which is the compounding error, right? So errors compounding as you measure different things. I just want to ask you this now. So I was recently in I think it was a workshop, and we were talking about what you said about the errors in the clinical notes. And then I just thought like, okay, so it just occurred to me about this idea of compounding error, how we have papers where we build a model, let's say a natural language processing model that can extract certain variables from clinical notes. And then that model is validated in the sense that, it goes through a process, and then you have a nice paper that says, hey, this is the accuracy, this is the sensitivity and the specificity of this metric. Fine, happy days. And then let's say we're happy with whatever margin of error we're having there. And then we go on with that variable. And now we introduce that variable into, maybe it's an epidemiological analysis study. And then let's say we do some logistic regression, whatever. The thing is, we end up with an estimate of what is the relationship between that variable. Let's say in our earlier conversation, we were using anedonia as an example, and whatever outcome we are looking at, right? And we show some confidence intervals, some level of confidence around that estimate of the relationship, the link, or the statistical link between those two variables. But in that estimation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen anyone saying, well, but wait a minute, because actually the variable itself has another confidence interval around it. Surely that has to affect the confidence interval of our estimation.
Gotcha.
Am I missing something here? Like, why no one is talking about, because my question then is, if we do a formal mathematical or statistical, however you want to call it, analysis of this, will we be surprised of why these confidence intervals are? And maybe we're just like, because at the end of the day, we always say, hey, rubbish in, rubbish out, right? But then we actually have a measure of how rubbish a variable is, say. We're not using that measure anywhere else. We're just saying, we're happy that this is actually quite accurate. But still, you have some level of uncertainty there.
Yeah.
So I don't know, would love to hear what is your take on this.
That's an incredibly profound question that I've not been asked for. No, not at all. No, and to be honest, I don't have a pre-prepared answer for that one. So the idea is, so if for example, if I understand you correctly, so you're saying that if we were to go through and tag, all mentions of anhedonia in a group of patients' records, and then we were to hand that over to a data science colleague, so a clinician we trust with that job, we say, you go through and annotate that, that's your expertise. Then we hand that data over to a data scientist, and then they produce some. They're likely to read. Let's say you just take for each patient the count of mentions of the word anhedonia, right? If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is when the clinician was doing that annotation, there may be some fuzzy border cases where it's kind of, it's more or less what we mean by anhedonia. So I'm going to snap, a bit like snap to grid on your favorite, Illustrator software, right? It's kind of, it's more anhedonia than it's not. So I'll just say it's yes for that one. So those errors are propagated through to you when you hand data to
I suppose that would be the second error. The first one is the one you have been talking about in terms of the artifact of actually writing the notes. So that would be the first error. The second error will be the one that you just described. And then the third error now, when the data science the scientist
Right,
gets
yeah,
this
got you.
data and build the model is that the fact that the model is not accurate 100% of the times, that's the third error. So we keep compounding every time we move away from the source.
Yes, back to that abstraction principle. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I don't know of any work that looks at a systematic way of presenting or propagating those errors, right? Because you got error introduced by the clinical coder, in this case a clinician scanning through looking for things that are polysemous or have the same meaning as anhedonia and then like you say, you're adding to that what you hand to the data scientist, and you can say, well, we know that there's going to be some patients that do have that feature but weren't recorded because when we sampled the EHR we missed out a whole bunch of patients who who were discharged more than 10 years ago, so we haven't got any records. So there's that kind of, so if you take that all the way through, like you say, to an epidemiological, what is the prevalence of anhedonia in a population, then there's no way you could rely on that data. And I think you've articulated that kind of, that process where those biases start to come in. But I don't know that there's any, this may just reflect my ignorance, but I don't know of any systematic studies that show how you can accommodate that so that you are exposing that wide uncertainty when you're looking at the associations or the inferential analyses that you might do. I'm not aware of anything that tries to factor that in, but it's a hugely interesting problem, right? Because as you say, if we're going to make best use of this data, we need some way of capturing. It's almost kind of like the veracity and the provenance of the variable that our data scientist is looking at as basically one column in a matrix. They're looking at that column and thinking that they can rely on that. And if you were to go behind the spreadsheet, if you like, behind the column of data, there's a whole bunch of folks that would tell you differently, which is that it's the best approximation we have.
And what, as you said, there are often, or not often, there are cases where we don't have a measurement of the uncertainty. But then it's like, well, okay, but sometimes we do, like, for example, that third step where we, the data scientist now fits the model and this is the error estimate. Let's use that. At the very least, let's use the measurements that we do have. If it makes you feel any better, I asked that in a room full of experts and no one knew of anything out there. I just wanted to know your
right.
take.
Yeah.
Right. So just moving on a little bit, but on the same, you mentioned or you suggest that we should be using, completely agree with this, statistics, biostatistics, and epidemiology as sanity checks. Can you elaborate on this a little bit, please?
Yeah, for sure. So after basically dunking on EHR data for the whole of this podcast, I can see lots of use cases that we won't have time to go into where you can actually use that data, and you can use data science, computational methods, machine learning and AI. They can absolutely be used for good effect and good purpose, no doubt, right? Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes we get so engrossed and wrapped up in what's new and shiny and exciting that we sometimes forget that we've got a host of colleagues, epidemiologists, biostatisticians, statisticians, who can tell us an awful lot about the assumptions that we might be making using those methods and techniques. In our previous discussions, Marcos, we were talking about, the theoretical rigor and the guarantees that statisticians seek from their methods. Mm-hmm. And the thing that, that we kind of admire about the machine learning folks is very often from an engineering background, and there's a certain pragmatism to engineering, which is like, have a go and see if it works. And now I realize I've completely offended and alienated all of my engineering colleagues, but there's a pragmatism there, that's about getting something done, with less concern about whether or not it's the best, least biased estimate of a particular parameter. Mm-hmm. So striking a balance between those two things is, I think, is invariably important. And I think very often my colleagues as statisticians provide the guardrails for some of the more wacky ideas that I try out. And when you run it past them, they just tell you clearly that's very cool. But you just need to be aware.
I love that's the key word. Cool.
Cool is the key word on that one, right? But you need to be aware that, and they'll usually point you to a set of papers that clearly say why that's not a good idea. And listen, just from a very personal perspective, so that when I started working or becoming obsessed with what we can do with EHR data, I initially assumed that the EHRs were the best population sampling tool we had. And I remember saying to my colleague, I really hope he doesn't hear this, but I remember saying to, oh man, I'm telling you, the classic gold standard experimental method of RCTs in medicine, I'm telling you that its days are numbered, because if you think about it, EHRs, provide a complete sample of the joint distribution of all patients for a given set of disorders. And I remember him looking at me going, oh yeah, okay, I'll get back to me in 10 years time. Let me know how it's going. And of course that was just from a place of utter ignorance on my part about what statisticians do and whatever do. And when I spoke to them, they were kind of like, yeah, but what about? And then it's like, oh yeah, no, I hadn't seen it that way. And then I remember statisticians saying, well, all you're talking about there is, they gave me this model in my head of joint distributions and how you need to sample this probably large, hugely dimensional, or a space of huge dimensions. And of course, then it reminded me that you have the curse of dimensionality. It's like Bellman's curse. And I remember thinking, oh God, I've just all that enthusiasm for saying that the sum of EHRs will sample all possible combinations of patient demographics. What a stupid thing to say. And that's what brought me to the big data paradox. So that's exactly what that says, right? Is that if you're not ill, you're not probably going to go and see a certain medical specialty for a certain problem. You won't then feature in the data. So I've got no data on people who never have that illness, right? Or if an illness only affects people in a certain age bracket, right? And that's your EHR only focuses on people with those kinds of illnesses, right? You're never going to know anything about people outside the age bracket. So you're never really truly sampling, properly getting an evenly distributed sample of this joint distribution. And it's for me that embarrassing lesson comes from talking to my colleagues who are statisticians and epidemiologists, and they made me see the error of my engineering pragmatism, which is like, if I only add together enough EHRs, I can sample the entire joint distribution, no probs. Totally wrong.
Well, there you go.
But it's fun to be naive.
But
it's the best way to learn.
Yeah. And I guess that is, if you ask me, that is the cool thing about what we do, is that we get to work with people with vastly different expertise than what we have, and it's just so enriching speaking with them.
It's kind of fun, isn't it?
Yeah. Just the last point that I wanted to touch on, based on that blog that you wrote, you say something like, the people tend to say, we're using machine learning instead of, let's call it, standard statistical methods, because machine learning will find out nonlinear relationships.
Oh yeah.
and that kind of like bothered you a little bit. It's like, what do you mean exactly, right? So
yeah.
So can you expand, please? But I will preempt by saying, we have been of course. We talked about this earlier, because the moment I read that, I said, I kind of say this sometimes, but then it's like clarifying what I mean by that.
Right.
But it's you. Anyway, I just want to hear from you what you meant, and
Gotcha.
and I absolutely agree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is starting from a point of mutual agreement. I can tell you what I mean by it, and I can broaden it out a little bit to make it more of a usable principle. But we used to make this joke about 7 or 8 years ago. You say, if you're pitching to a business, okay, everything's AI, right? If you're pitching to scientists or researchers or engineers, computer science, it's machine learning, right? That has changed, right? But precision in language for me is quite important with these things. So I kept hearing people say, in the work that we've done, where we've looked at the literature on applications of like machine learning techniques in psychiatry, the lack of precision in language struck me as worrying, because you can get away with anything if you can just put up a banner that says this is the current cool thing. And the nonlinear interactions thing just struck me as it seemed weird to hang a lot of. Honestly, there are a ton of papers which say, where you think, this is a problem perfectly suited to maximum likelihood estimation, right? of a straightforward textbook statistical inferential model. And then they say, oh, we use machine learning, and you just scratch your head and think, why? And say, oh, because it detects non interactions. And then everyone reading it goes, oh, that's why you used it. Oh, I get it now. And you think, what does that mean? And we talked about this earlier. I mean, if you just draw out a logistic regression as if it was a multi-layer perceptron, right, you very quickly see how the variables are flowed forward and then combined. And when you stack more layers on it, you can see how these, what you might describe as, long range or interactions that may or may not be nonlinear. You can see how that pans out. Just in the same way, you could just write the combination of all possible interactions of your variables and put them into a linear weighted sum in a standard regression framework. I think the point there, and the other thing we talked about that will allude to this is just using a term without grounding it out, without breaking down what you mean by it, can quite often excuse a lot of. We all like to think we know what the other person's saying. So explainability in AI was the other one we talked about, which kind of grates a little bit because you say, well, what does that actually mean? And people just say, oh, it means knowing what the model's doing. And you're like, well, what do you mean knowing what the model's doing? And it goes back to sort of really straightforward examples. If you speak to a lot of, again, not dunking on any one profession, but it's actually quite hard to understand logistic regression, right? I mean, and if you ask a whole bunch of folks, you'll get very different answers. So if we can't even agree on that, and that is the bedrock of medical statistics in many ways, if we can't even get particularly clinicians to agree on that definition, just saying explainability or nonlinear interaction strikes me as a very dangerous thing without peeking under the hood and seeing what's actually going on underneath. So it's I'm sorry I can't give you a like kind of pithy kind of summary of that, but it's just taking as read. It's received wisdom. That's it. That's what I meant. It's this idea there is received wisdom that we all, oh yeah, well, it's nonlinear. We all understand what we mean by that, don't we? And we're like, yeah, no, we do. And then you go away scratching your head thinking, well, I'm not actually sure I do. And importantly, right, if you're going to spend time, energy, money, and you're going to ask patients to trust you doing that research, right, you ought to be able to ground it out a bit more than we were looking for nonlinear interactions. I think you have to be a bit more precise than that and say why you're doing it. And the other thing it leads to, and again, back to me being quite opinionated on this particular topic, it leads to this idea that you can just take toolboxes and apply them blindly to a problem without any consideration of what the limitations of those methods are. Like we were saying, statisticians have taught me the limitations of my utter stupidity on a number of occasions, but they've also taught me the limitations of certain models. And it's only when you read it in detail, I think, that you really understand what's meant by these terms. We've been liberally throwing around the word uncertainty, right? Now, I bet if I went back and talked to my colleagues who specialize in the area of uncertainty, they'd be hugely critical of us for just throwing that word around. And I get their point.
Sorry about that.
No, but that's that's sort of the point, isn't it? When you're dealing with healthcare, you're not dealing with, it's not a consumer product, right? So it does matter if you're leaning on assumptions, or received wisdom, that can't really be backed up, sorry to do a plug, but the nonlinear interactions and explainability. When we looked at the literature on explainability in AI applied in psychiatry and mental health, the most common way of defining explainability was to say, we use an explainability toolbox. So your definition of explainability is we use some Python code or some R code that we downloaded from GitHub. That for me is completely unsatisfactory. And I think that's why, you sort of tapped into that with the nonlinear thing as well. It's just like you say nonlinear interactions between what and when and how does that manifest in the output you're seeking to prove to me, or whether he was trying to show is useful.
And what you said earlier about, is it really necessary? And
is it necessary?
There will be cases, I think anyway, when yes, it will be necessary. We use it a lot on research on suicide prevention, where we know the interactions between all the different risk factors are complex. And what we mean by nonlinear, we mean exactly that. We mean to be fair, often I think we don't say non-linear. What we say is complex interactions, and the fact that some machine learning algorithms will allow you will find these complex interactions, but then the point is to then go in, say, and okay, what are these interactions, and learn what are these interactions, if there are any, what are they, so that then we can, as you said, once you know them, you can plug them into a more traditional statistical model.
Right.
Definitely simpler. And then there you go. You have your nonlinear or your complex or whatever you want to call it interaction without using machine learning in the end.
This is what you were explaining to me earlier on, Marcus. I remember, you explained this to me really, really, really clearly, which is very often you need to start from a solid understanding of the data that you're working with and the expectations you have in it. And I can't remember the phrase that you used precisely, but it's just start with the most basic models and work up to complexity. Whereas I think there is a danger just applying something because it's cool, right? Or because it's available, or because you read a paper on it on Archive last week, doesn't necessarily mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And that's the danger. And I think there's also a risk of you lose the cultural memory of that discipline in doing so. So we talked about an example earlier where I remember speaking to a colleague who was really, really expert on deep neural networks, and really was making a really persuasive argument. But I was surprised to find out that they were puzzled when I asked them, how does it relate to k nearest neighbors and instance learning? And they were like, well, what's k nearest neighbors? And you just think, how could you know all that stuff but not know these sort of foundational principles? And I think you were saying to me when you were teaching, you always teach your students to, start with a robust understanding of the data, look at the data carefully with your own eyes, work out what patterns you think you can see, and then try and build automated ways of finding those patterns, or perhaps even doing it with more precision. Don't just dive in with the coolest, funkiest thing you can download for your preferred data science language this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Simpler is always better, I think. I completely lost track of what you were saying something, and I was thinking, this is anyway. I'll go back to it when it comes back to me. You mentioned explainable AI, so you have. So I would like you to please walk us through this framework that you published called TIFU, the TIFU framework for understandable AI. If you can, please.
Yeah. So. That was a paper that me and some colleagues wrote a couple of years back, and it followed on from exactly this this peculiar frustration I seem to have with what does something mean? What does it mean? So again, it was explainability, and I remember talking to some colleagues who are really expert in machine learning, and saying to them, I keep reading about this concept of explainability, and I'm not really sure I get it. And where we started to write the paper, we sort of went back to sort of some simple principles. So in sort of medical statistics, right, it's actually quite hard to explain how logistic regression actually works, right? So, and you wouldn't expect a busy clinician to sit there and think about carefully whether or not a standardized beta coefficient can be easily translated to an odds ratio and what that means in terms of the change in probability of the outcome. No one would expect, you're busy, right? And you've got to make decisions in a reasonably short time frame. So they count nomograms, right? So nomograms are basically straight lines with values plotted on them, and then you put a ruler through points on those straight lines, and it tells you the answer you're looking for, right? And nomograms have been around since the early 20th century. So that struck me as something that was kind of, it wasn't explainability. That didn't explain logistic regression or anything like that. Well, it didn't explain a particularly complex calculation. But what it did do is allow you to kind of have a presentation of the outputs of that algorithm, or that computation that you could then refer to and use, to make your decision as a clinician. So when we started talking about that, we thought, well, let's go and have a look at the literature, right? And I've already told you the anecdote, so I won't repeat it in detail, but it seemed to me it was the same thing. It's like we used explainable AI, and you just say, explainable AI, and there'd be a citation to a GitHub package, or a library for Python or something. And it's just like, so you're going to tell me that you're going to explain to me, no pun intended, that explainable AI is because you use an explainable ML method with reference to that. You never really tell me what you mean by explainability. So we looked at that literature. We found that it wasn't at all clear. And again, it might be clear in the pure machine learning literature. There might be clarity there, but it certainly wasn't evident in the applied literature when you take those models and use them in psychiatry and mental health. And then back to the nomogram example, we just thought, well, what do we really want? We've now got algorithms that are getting more and more complex to the point where there's probably not, I think it's not unfair to say that no single human being could sit down and understand mechanically how an input gets transformed through a massive deep neural network or a transformer model. I don't think anyone could do that, right? And actually, it just probably reflects my lack of mathematical ability, but it's actually quite hard to do it with logistic regression, right? It's not trivially easy, and it's certainly not quick to do, right? You have to sit down with a bit of paper and work it out. So we focused our efforts on saying what we really desire here is understandability. I need to understand when I put this data in to some black box model, whatever the model might be. I'm not committing to black box models versus, transparent ones at all. I'm just saying any model, you're putting data in, you're getting outputs, right? A very logical way to think about presenting that information to a clinician is what if I change one of those variables? Do I understand what happens on the output? So a bit like sensitivity analysis. So we thought, what would we need for understandability, and why do we need it? And you need understandability in the way I've just explained it. You need that because a clinician has to lean or trust that model to do something. And if that model behaves unpredictably, or the behavior of the model when you vary one of the inputs and look at the outputs, if that is confusing, not understandable to a clinician, then the clinician's not going to trust it. So we kind of sort of re-derived the idea from the principle of understandability, and then we looked at the literature on explainability, the more theoretical and engineering literature on it, and we thought, how can we try and align these concepts? And what we came up with was just a set of what we sort of reference principles, which is it is going to be the case that for some applications you have to use these really big complex black box models that you could never stand a chance of mechanically understanding. So if I put the number 32.7 or 42.9, and then it's like, right, well, go and follow that all the way through a 9 billion parameter neural network, you're never going to get there, right? So we can't do that. But we really do need some of the utility that we get from those models, right? And the great example being, processing images, right? Medical imaging. So we do need them. So we just tried to articulate in that paper a set of rules that we suggested that people follow in order that you don't get tripped up, so that you can understand what it's doing. And it won't go over all of the sort of ideas we articulated in that. But one of them was around presentation, which sort of loops us back to the nomogram argument, right? Is you're never going to be able to understand it mechanically. So at least present the inputs and the outputs in such a way that a clinician, can see the output you're getting from the model has some systematic correspondence with the inputs that make sense clinically. So if I increase the age of a patient, it goes into a giant predictive model, for want of a better word, and then the risk goes up for a particular event. A clinician's likely to, if that makes sense, so older people do have a higher risk of that, that's going to make sense to the clinician. So if you can present that data in a way that exposes, back to your point, if it exposes the uncertainties, it shows you the behavior of the system in a way that appears logical, it doesn't trip you up. That's what we thought would be understandable. And then we articulated how you might achieve that. And one of the ways is in how you present the inputs and outputs. The other way is about how you transform the inputs and either feature select or feature engineer. So we said that those processes need to stand in correspondence to what clinicians understand those variables to mean. So that's all we did, really. We just tried to define a set of things that rolled back from a quite nebulous concept of explainability we tried to roll it back to something that we thought, well, we used the term understandable, and then we just said, well, what are the things you need for that? And we I'm not saying we were in any way right about this, but it just seemed like a logical thing to write at the time, which was, sort of transparency of features was one thing. Interpretability, which I do actually, I will stand strongly behind that principle. So, Cynthia Rudian's work on interpretable models, I think, actually really does stand up. But interpretability doesn't have to be one thing, right? You can have interpretability of parameterization. So in classic logistic regression, where you can interpret the parameters of the model as odds ratios if you do a bit of post-processing, right? And instantly that links to the clinician. The clinician says, oh, no, I get what you mean now, that the odds ratio is 1.0, it means no effect, right? So you can link it back to what clinicians can work with. So that's the sort of interpretability by parameterization. And then we said, look, if you're really stuck, right, 9 billion parameter models, there's no parameterization interpretability there, right? Well, then you have to kind of fall back on presentation, which is where we started that discussion, which is just make it obvious to the clinician how changes in the inputs relate to changes in the outputs.
Right. I correct me if I'm wrong, but just to interpret what you have just explained, I think this ties up very well with the fact that you have a very pragmatic view of how we use machine learning to help clinicians, which is, sure, it will be great if we could understand 100% how this model is coming up with this prediction, whatever that is. But let's be realistic. It's not always going to be possible.
Yeah.
Let's work out, in what lab, in what, I guess, in the scale of explainability, where can we do something so that at least we can, and this is another thing that I liked about what you were saying is, as a data scientist, is we need to move close to the clinician. We need to build something that is of use to the clinician. We're not building something for ourselves. We're building something for another different population, other people that need things in a specific way that is actually often quite different to what we need. Is that a fair way of?
If it should have written that paper for us, man. It would have been a lot more concise, a lot less wordy. No. Sorry. No, that's well. I think that's exactly the point, right? Is don't forget your audience. Focus on deployment, not on cool stuff, and make sure you're doing something where you can look under the hood. Again, that's a recurrent theme in our discussion is, can I look under the hood so I've got at least some assurances that I know what's going on, rather than received wisdom, which, as we've already discussed, is something that I think is quite dangerous.
Yeah, and I remember what I wanted to say, and it's great because it's still on point, which is that thing of I'm just going to apply this, and then that's explainability. And I actually don't know what I'm doing. I'm just applying a method that I've been told it's explainability, and it's the absolute dangers of that. And I guess just as an anecdote, it's like students applying this thing, whatever algorithm they have found, and then them telling me, oh, look, I don't know, let's say, I found out that height and weight were actually not relevant, in the explainability scale, whatever, it was not relevant. And it's like, well, surely, do you know that, your method, that method that you have selected cannot account for, correlated variables. So of course you take weight,
right,
and then you take height. They are going to be strongly correlated. So you're taking away part of that, the ability to find out how actually important they are. And I think that speaks to what you were saying of the dangers of just, I have a toolbox that allows me to run like 100 different methods and just going to apply all of them.
Yes.
And then I'm going to assume that I'm doing great.
Absolutely. And then just run Shapley or Lime or one of the the explainability toolboxes. And it's not to dunk on them. I think there's I think this is our overarching message today, right? Isn't it? It's all of these things are valuable, yeah, but you just have to pay attention to what you're doing, and you know, there's that joke that I've heard a few times, but it's you know, I think I can't speak for you, Mark, but look, I'm a data scientist because I used to be a computer scientist, right? And I'll have a go at a little bit of statistics, right? But I'll absolutely back away from that and say I have no credentials as a statistician, right? And when you ask statisticians, they very quickly correct you or disabuse you of your misunderstanding, right? So it goes back to that point of there's nothing more dangerous really than a doctor with a copy of SPSS, right? Because you can put data in it and you lower the bar to entry, which is, you know, democratizing. But by the same token, I mean, even Doug Altman said this about the biomedical literature, right? And he said that, you know, I can't remember when he published the paper, but it was certainly 20, 25 years ago. And he made the point that the literature is full of noise because of badly executed methodology. And I think, I don't know if you'd agree, but when we were doing that, reviewing that literature for the explainability work, it just became abundantly clear that, you know, that there were people just trying their luck with these things and then saying, well, it's explainable because we use an explainability toolkit. And it's kind of that isn't grounding out the problem. That's just deferring the problem to something else, right? As you say. And I don't know. It's back to our received wisdom thing. It's kind of, sometimes you just need to interrogate the detail and just find out what you really mean by it. And I have read some really egregious examples. And again, I'm not statistically fluent enough to make this claim, but even I can see, that what they've done is taken some data. They've not done anything to reassure me that they've validated the model either just using internal validation. So essentially they're double dipping the data and they're reporting the incredible performance of their algorithm on the training set, essentially, right? And there are good reasons sometimes not to do that or sometimes to do that. But what they're reporting these things, and then you're saying, because it's now cool to talk about explainability, wow, we report we use the kind of Shapley method to report feature importance, right? And then they present the feature importance table. And then in the conclusions, it's like, we found these are now the clinically most important fit. And you're like, dude, hold it. You really haven't, you've done none of the heavy lifting that your colleagues, your statistician colleagues would have done to build a robust inferential model to answer the question, what are the most important features or the most important variables? You haven't done that. You've just tacked on something at the end because it's an availability bias, just because there happens to be something. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And then you've presented it, you fed it back to the literature and the community as these factors are the most important. And it's a bit like the kind of shortcutting behavior you see with deep neural networks on radiological imaging tasks. Is you can often be surprised that they're learning things that have nothing to do with the clinical reality. It just happened to be an artifact in the data set that meant you could shortcut it. You could go straight from that feature to getting reasonable performance when you optimize an objective function that's percentage, when you optimize an objective function that is based on a binary classification performance, right? A discriminative measure of performance. So it kind of worries me that, I'm sure this is true. I've been asked to look at a few papers where they tell me they've discovered some new risk for something really important. I mean, and without being too deliberately performatively emotional about it. But I read one paper that claimed to have discovered new risk factors for people dying by suicide. I mean, so this is a real example. And the way they did it was, some slightly ham-fisted machine learning, and then reporting feature importance afterwards, and then saying, look, no one's ever thought of this before. And it was kind of like, well, you've in no way persuaded me that you've discovered anything there. But what you have shown me is that there's artifact in your data that you failed to account for. You've adopted none of the rigor of a statistical or an inferential model, and then you've run a toolkit, an availability bias thing again. You've run a toolkit on it, and now you're trying to feed back to the community that you've missed these factors. And it's kind of, there's no guarantees there. Nothing about your method is robust enough to make that claim. So, and that worries me a great deal, right? Because then people go and start thinking that paper is robust either statistically or epidemiologically, it is a robust inferential model, then we're in danger. And I think that's what Doug Altman was trying to say. You know, he said that statistics is not it's not a have a go enterprise, right? You know, you and I have some shared understanding of some of the ideas, but you really need somebody who knows what they're doing and is fully trained to, you know, to tell you when you're going wrong. And I think, as particularly in machine learning, we rarely subject ourselves to that rigor in the same way our colleagues as statisticians would.
Right. So I guess it goes back to what we were saying earlier, or you mentioned in that blog, which is statistics, biostatistics, and epidemiology as sanity checks. And I loved just two things that you said, which is they were just trying their luck. I love it because it perfectly encapsulates what they do. And another one that I loved as well is just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And definitely, I agree with that 100%. Just because you can, we were laughing earlier because it's like, you know, it's like just because you can use machine learning doesn't mean that you should be using machine learning.
Precisely that. That's a good template for that one.
Yeah. Why? On the other hand, I just said why. Now I just said just because you can use machine learning doesn't mean that you should. But why do you think, if so, why do you think machine learning, AI, is crucial in mental health? Do you think it is crucial? Do you think it's important for mental health research practice?
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen, right? Mm-hmm. And again, so this is, forgive me if this isn't directed at you in any way, but back to the idea of precision in language. You know, what do you mean by mental health, right? Right. So it may be in some areas of the landscape of mental health, there may be some utility for what we now call AI or machine learning or whatever it might be. There may be some utility there. I mean, I'm not qualified to say yes or no to that. It kind of remains to be seen. But as we have been doing in our previous discussions, Marcos, you know, we can spitball ideas where we think the pragmatism of some of those techniques might be useful, right? So one thing we talked about a lot was clinicians have to read through a lot of information, right? In EHR, pathology results, very, very, sometimes very, very wordy narrative descriptions of patient presentations or symptoms or signs. There's a wealth of data for patients who've been well known to a particular hospital or service. You got all that. Wouldn't it be great if we could help clinicians do their job better? And one thing we do know about clinicians, and I know I'm just pulling us back to the discussion of natural language processing, but one thing we know is humans get tired quickly, and we, no matter what we like to pretend, we've got a fairly limited attention span. Some of us more so than others, right? But wouldn't it be great if we could give clinicians the facility, to use whatever computational method it might be to do their jobs better? And one thing that I think would be really useful, and again, it's an opinion, is trawling through volumes of data, particularly in, you know, a patient's medical record, and quickly telling me or giving me an assessment of things that I really ought to attend to, So, you know, saying, Dan, be aware that when we look at this particular angle, when we filter the patient's data through this lens, you really ought to be attending to this. You really ought not to neglect that, you know. And that's where I can see what the modern, that kind of contemporary conception of AI being useful. And underneath that, there may be a whole bunch of machine learning techniques and algorithms that might be useful there. But, and again, it remains to be seen. There are other angles that I've heard people talk about. So we tend to equate AI with, you know, the kind of generative AI that you see in chatbots. That seems to be an unfortunate equation, I think, in the kind of popular reading of the space. And there's a superficial similarity between what a chatbot does and what people imagine a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or a social worker do. That superficial similarity is beguiling, right? But I'm not sure it's accurate, right? So this is such a tired example, but it's brilliant, so it's worth repeating, right? Joseph Weizenbaum wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, and in that he documents his experiment in the late 60s where he produced the chatbot Eliza. He didn't call it a chatbot, right? But it was you can download Eliza, you just Google it and then download the code, and obviously it's just basically it's rules and pattern matching, and it's articulated in a few hundred lines of code, right? I mean, no one's going to argue that's smart, right? It's a cool parlor trick, but there's no real intelligence behind it. Yeah. But his administrator was so persuaded that they were communicating with a Rogerian therapist that they asked Weizenbaum to keep his office door closed during lunch so they could talk to it in private, or teletype with it in private. I worry a bit that we're sometimes as human beings easily led by superficial similarities, right? So, just because one of the tools that I use to do my job as a psychiatrist is talking to people, yeah, it doesn't mean that it's all chat. And it doesn't mean that it's all just kind of like, oh, that's interesting to hear that. Why don't you tell me more about which was the Eliza scam? It just picked the last noun that I'm not getting on very well with my husband right now. And it's like, tell me more about your husband. It's like the most superficial kind of dialogue you can imagine. But it worries me a little bit that people sort of see that connection, that beguiling superficial similarity, make an assumption about the home discipline, be it the expertise of a counseling psychologist or a clinical psychologist, and then just assuming that, oh well, I can see that these people talk to each other in a back and forth way. Maybe a chatbot can do the same job. And then you see people I'm deliberately hedging my bets a bit on this one or I'm being non-specific about it, because there's a really good example, an egregious example of this in the literature, of the evaluation of a particular chatbot. And I remember reading it, and the headline summary was that it was involved in diagnosing mental illness. It was involved in preventing really awful outcomes for people. And I remember reading it and thinking, there's nothing in your evaluation or your paper that in any way supports the conclusions that you've drawn from it. But it's beguiling, right? Because if you don't come from it from the perspective of someone who works with health data, or you don't come at it from the perspective of someone who works clinically, or you don't appreciate that there's some nuances to certain clinical practices that aren't just having a chat with people, you could easily be persuaded of that. And you could easily then start building. I mean, in this example, I firmly believe that the paper that I'm deliberately not naming is, I mean, it was really a sales pitch, right? It was a paper to peer review wash, in order presumably to raise the value of the investment in that company. I mean, that's the only thing I can conclude. But that I think that's disingenuous and egregious, and I would like to see much less of that. But that speaks to the idea that I don't have an answer to your question, which is it useful or not? I really don't know. And I think the way to answer it is for more precision in what we're asking of it. What do you mean by mental health? What do you mean by AI? And then defining very narrowly what you want those things to do and for what purpose, right? So I can tell you what I would find helpful. If someone can provide me with tech to solve some of my problems, I can articulate those very clearly. And I think I can give you a clear functionality, a clear specification, what I would expect of those tools. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of them that you and I have been talking about was, wouldn't it be helpful to have something that was able to positively expose the signal for someone who's at risk of self-harm or self-injurious behavior? Mm-hmm. I would actually find that useful as a clinician. So the way to develop technology around that is to sit down with a bunch of clinicians and say, as engineers, what should we go looking for? As data scientists, what should we be alert to? And then trying it out and then ground truthing it, if you like, or validating it against clinicians and saying, does this help? Is this useful? That strikes me as a more prosaic way of using those technologies in mental health settings. The thing I'm less persuaded by is, the idea that that a chatbot is somehow doing what a clinical psychologist does in treatment. I mean, I just find that ludicrous, if I'm being honest. I may be wrong, right? I mean, I'm very opinionated on this. I could be entirely wrong, yeah? But you'd need to do a lot of work to persuade me that I'm entirely wrong.
I would agree with that.
Don't see that work happening.
On that line, natural language processing, large language models, that's the area you work on, I believe, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, or one of the areas.
Some colleagues, I work with some of my super colleagues on some applications of LLMs,
Yeah. What are they? And more importantly, what are they not? Right?
Because you're trying to provoke me now, Mark.
No.
You're trying to get me to say something.
No, please no. But there seems to be a bit of like, I think, misconception of what they are not doing. In terms of like, now I'm going to get myself maybe in trouble, but hey ho. Like,
that's what editing's for.
we can edit this out, like reasoning and like sentient, thinking and all that. And personally, I think they are not reasoning, and I think that they are just probabilistic models. That they are really good at what they do. End of the story. But I don't know, maybe wrong. I don't know if you think differently.
I think I share your view. So my view is you can articulate and work through the algorithms, right, in the papers that describe how the individual units in a large language model work, right? So, I mean, to take transformers as the model unit for the transformer, I mean, you can work through that. And I mean, I've got a superficial understanding of that and I can see that. But ultimately, it strikes me that these are models that are designed and trained, with different objective functions granted, right? But fundamentally, it's going to be doing one of two things. It's either like fill in the missing blank, so plausible pattern completion in a mass language setting, for example, or next item, next token, next phrase prediction for some of the LLMs or some of the transform-based models. So it seems to me that you've got either a sort of generative approach, and I mean generative in the sense of you can sample from them, right? Or you've got a sort of autoregressive type model where you're training it to predict the next most likely thing in a sequence. Yeah. And I'm not persuaded that that is qualitatively radically different from the mathematics of, any other process built around the same ideas. I mean, there's some engineering ingenuity in it, no doubt, but fundamentally there's no magic there, right? We understand what it's doing. I think we're just surprised by how much you can do with it, right? So if you make these models really, or the parameter spaces for them huge, and you pile in enough data, and I think we sometimes forget that it's also enough data, right? Mm-hmm. It's pretty cool what you can do, with everything you could ever scrape off the internet piled into a giant, however many billion parameter model. And the transformer and the transformer architecture. I mean, that's pretty remarkable stuff. And then what you can do when you package these LLMs as foundation models, and then you make them available for other people to then do other things with, like sort of domain adapt them or fine tune them, and then the stuff that you can do with prompting on them. It's pretty cool, right? I just don't know that. It feels like a scale-up phenomenon to me. And I know there's an argument about emergence at a certain threshold of scale. I get that. But I don't find it persuasive, right? I think what it really... You used the phrase earlier, Marcus, that really summed it up. It's amazing what you can do with sort of statistical regularities in enormous amounts of data, I think was the way you said it. So the statistical regularity, or extracting those regularities, and at the same time doing it in enough data, you actually get surprising performance, things you never expected to happen. I'm just not sure I would equate emergence with I didn't expect it to happen, right? If your criteria for emergence, which as I understand it is a deeply complicated scientific and philosophical concept, right? if your definition of it is, oh, we weren't expecting that, that's hardly emergence, right? That's hardly a very grounded explanation for it. So again, with those things, it seems to me that it's very easy to be, they're beguiling, right? Who would have thought, you could sit and type pretty much anything any question that came into your head, and you would get a plausible answer from a computer. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. It's mind-blowing, actually, when you think about it. But just because it's mind-blowing and unexpected, it doesn't mean you should overinvest. You shouldn't heap a load of functionality onto or explanations that don't necessarily hold up. So the emergence thing is one thing for me, and the reasoning thing is another. I think what it can do, or what they can do in the general purpose sense, right? I think if you're doing it for example, mathematical theorem proving, I think it's a different discussion to have. I'm talking about the kinds of foundation models that you might be interacting with as a user. What you're seeing as reasoning there, I think, is a bit more of a parlor trick. I think it's reasoning if and only if that's captured in some statistical regularities expressed in language, right? Apples are either green or red, right? You could argue you could argue that's sort of inductive reasoning, right? Or you could just say, if it just so happens that someone's written apples are either green or red enough times on Wikipedia or the internet generally, right? That doesn't strike me as qualitatively reasoning in a meaningful way that I would recognize as that. And a topic for another occasion maybe, but the way we've talked about medical decision making, medical reasoning, inference, and decision making is the way I think about that as someone who introspectively reflects on what they do when they're doing that, and having a look at the literature about medical reasoning and decision making. I'm not persuaded that a lot of the papers on LLMs that claim that they are doing medical reasoning or medical decision making, I'm less persuaded, and I don't think it requires a lot of interrogation to see why it's not persuasive. It's because the benchmarks that are being used are presumed to be tests of clinical reasoning, but a test of clinical reasoning is not the same as clinical reasoning. Like a map is not the territory. It's that kind of thing. So showing me that you can outperform a doctor on a postgraduate medical exam doesn't persuade me that your model is reasoning in the same way, or reasoning in a useful and safe way, the way a doctor does. And remember that we use MCQs, multiple choice questions, to quickly examine the basic competence of every medical professional. No one believes that that's what you're doing in a clinical setting. At least I hope no one believes that, right? Because that would be tragic. And not to overinflate the complexity. A lot of what clinicians do could be cast as pattern classification, right? Or interpolation between prototype examples in some, nominal or imaginary space of patients. For sure, you can do that, but clinical decision making is not then drawing a hyperplane between two clusters and saying it's either diagnosis A or B. So it worries me when people use that machine learning concept of classification and equate it to decision making, and then by the same token in the sort of generative space of LLMs, because it performs really well on the USMLE exam doesn't necessarily mean it's doing the same thing. It's not doing the same types of reasoning that a clinician is, because actually the best way to train a clinician to get through those exams, I strongly suspect, based on personal experience, is to train them like a large language model, which is just to divide all the questions up into batches and keep rehearsing the batches in a pseudo-randomized order so that you don't overfit on any one of them, right? So that's how I train myself to pass a bunch of medical school exams. It's perhaps less surprising that strategy works, when you're training a machine to do the same thing. So, right. Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer to your question. No. There's a lot to unpack with it.
No, definitely. I'm sorry if I put you in a spot. I wasn't trying to put you in a spot there. But I think you're right. I think, I guess it comes down to how do you define certain things. I guess that's the first step. And we didn't, as you said, forget me, sorry, I don't remember. I forget the term you use for like implicit knowledge, something like that. Like we are assuming we're talking about the same thing, but potentially we don't. Yes, we're not, right? And it's like, I guess the first step or the first exercise that will need to be done is what do we mean when we talk about reasoning, when we talk about intelligence, when we talk about
got you.
emergence? It's like depending on how you define it. If it's like, well, if I tell you what is 2 + 2 and you tell me it's 10, well, I wasn't expecting that, so should I then assume that was an unexpected answer? Is that emergence? So I guess
being surprised by something,
being surprised
doesn't give it any more scientific value or validity. You can't just give it a cool name and say, it's emergence, right? So I guess that it's back to that call to arms, which is just for a precision in what we mean by things, so that we're not conning anyone.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's really important because this talks to the hype around AI and machine learning, and I'm going to use this here and I'm going to solve all your problems, and I think you speak about this, you talk about this in some of your blogs. It's like that, how this hype actually it damages progress, really, because then it affects trust, and then we need to work then not just on developing things that are really really work, but also now we have to build the trust that we actually did not. We as individuals, we didn't lose. We lost it as a community because some of us just oversell what we can actually do, and I think it's important. I guess it's also, it falls on us then, I guess, as well, to say, wait a minute, no, this is not what we're doing. This is not what we can do. As you said with the data, I think you call it like. I love the term. My memory is really bad, but I think you call it something like data alchemy or something like that. But suddenly, you've given me, say, I know this is not exactly what you describe, but it's like, you give me noise, and then I actually can get really good inference from that. It's just it's noise. If you give me noise, I just have noise to work with.
Yeah, we did talk about it, didn't we? I mean. And that goes back to the idea that if the sort of upper bound of what these things can do is essentially interpolation.
Yeah.
I think some people believe that they can do extrapolation, right, in a meaningful way, but I'm less persuaded by that. But I mean, most of the algorithms that I think you and I would consider to be the core toolbox of machine learning, right, fundamentally can only interpolate. So if all you've got is this artifact in the EHR, as we were discussing earlier, you've got to interpolate between the points that were present, right? And the data alchemy thing is a bit like that belief that you can turn lead into gold, but it turns out you required chemistry to tell us that wasn't possible, right? I just worry a bit that we just pretend that we've got this noisy, messy data, and that if we sprinkle the right sauce on it, this kind of special sauce that is AI, it will suddenly unlock these things, like turning lead into gold. I've just not seen any evidence that that's true. And let's assume that the predictions that people are making about generative AI, and I'm specifically mean generative LLMs, right, or the generative use cases of LLMs, let's assume that's true, yeah? You're going to have to be asking yourself the question is, on what basis is it, if I'm giving it what is clearly noise and it is not interpolating with respect to prototypes that it has learned or acquired as statistical regularities in the data, then what are you getting, and how are you going to prove to me that it's reliable, accurate, valid? And I don't see people asking that question. We keep benchmarking on, we keep evaluating performance on benchmarks, and assuming that, again, that the benchmark is is a foundation you can lean on, yeah. And I just am not persuaded by that. Right. So people have published benchmarking for mental health, right?
Yeah.
I remember looking at one of these papers and just thinking, what does that even mean, right? And how would I use your benchmark? And when I looked at it, it was divided into a series of domains, one of them which was safety. And then I looked at it, and their description of that domain, so presumably a set of inputs and outputs where you're supposed to score high by getting the same output for the same input. That's what you're using a benchmark for. It just struck me that the description they gave of it was so superficial. It stood no resemblance to the thing. And I think it was actually patient safety. It was like patient safety issues. And just looking at it, just thought that this is not a test, right? It does not robustly evaluate anything I find interesting as a clinician in terms of keeping people safe. So again, it's about, sorry, it's getting boring now, isn't it? But it's about precision in definition,
boring,
precision in language. I think that's what it comes down to. Just
it bears repeating. Yeah,
it does bear repeating.
It bears repeating. Yeah. Sadly, I guess we ought to start wrapping up. I don't even know for how long we have been talking, but
I've lost track of time.
I guess what will be one key, I mean, I guess you mentioned one of them, but what would be one key message that you would like our listeners to take away, about making AI really useful? And again, I go back, this idea stuck with me, that the fact that you have, and I love this about you, is that pragmatic view that you have about what can we do and what can we do, as in ability wise, and then what is useful to do with AI that is, as I said, truly useful, trustworthy in healthcare, or in mental health specifically. What would be a key message maybe that you would like people to take away?
That's actually, that's the one thing I can answer quite quickly and straightforwardly. It's, there's low hanging fruit. When if you go and spend a day with a clinical team or a clinician, or and look at the way that healthcare systems operate around trying to do the right thing and help patients get the right treatments for the right problems. If you look at that for a day, as a gifted, I was just thinking about some of my engineering colleagues or data science colleagues. Just imagine, just go and do that for a day, right? And I guarantee you'd come out with a side of A4 of really, really straightforward, low-hanging fruit things that could be solved. And I bet you could just map them directly onto algorithms, computational methods, toolboxes, whatever it might be. You'd very quickly be able to say, we could optimize that for you. We could do that quicker and more efficiently. We could make that process more safety netted, or we could put a safeguarding process around this very easily. So I think that's my takeaway message, is go and look for things that would make, and by the way, I'm talking about this from a very, very clinician perspective. You could do exactly the same, with people who use those services. So patients who use those services, you could do the same thing. I'm absolutely sure, right? I'm only speaking from a clinical perspective because I know navigating that as a professional better. So just spend a day with someone, and there's a ton of stuff that just needs solving, right? And that's, I think, where we should put a lot of our energy. And as we've talked about today, right, one thing is clinicians have short attention spans. They're fallible. We tire. So one thing that I really need is computational tools that quickly help me find the signal, the needle in the haystack that is the electronic health record, right? And I can give you really concrete examples of things like we've got one of our project management kind of schedule charts in Emmerich. We've got like list of stuff to do, and someone said, can Dan come up with a few example projects? And I always said, just give me half an hour and I'll get into. But there's a ton of stuff there, like loads and loads of stuff around patient safety, personalizing treatment, or finding ways to personalize treatment, optimizing systems to make them more efficient and make them less cumbersome. Loads of the things that are a product of humans being bad at something. And we're really good at inventing bureaucracy, but we're not very good at inventing systems that work fluidly. Just take that and work on that. And I bet you'll find applications that, for all of the techniques and tools and things that we've been discussing, there's plenty of applications for them there. But it's all low-hanging fruit. It's not spectacular stuff, right? This is not going to, you're not going to get the Nobel Prize for any of these things, but it's going to be stuff that makes a difference to the operation of a health system.
Then it's worth it, I would say. Definitely.
I would argue,
yeah. Where can our audience follow your work? So where can they find you? Social media?
Yeah. Well, things have changed since November 2024. So I've never been terribly active on social media. But I think going forward, the Mental Health Research for Innovation Centre, sorry to do a parochial plug,
please go ahead.
Since I work for them, I ought to do them. So Emmerich has a really, really strong social media and web presence. So I would suggest looking there, because all of the hard work that my colleagues, and by colleagues I mean, data scientists, statisticians, engineers, epidemiologists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists. I mean, there's just it's such a cool group of people. And of course, last but certainly not least, this is all being co-produced and directed by a team of experts by experience. So people who won't let us get away with using received wisdom. They'll pull us up and call us to task on, what do you mean when you say, when you say you want access to our data, what do you mean? Anyway, getting a bit distracted. But I'd certainly look for the Mental Health Research for Innovation Centre, which is this joint partnership between the University of Liverpool and Merseycare NHS Trust. Loads of the outputs on there I think are probably interesting to people. And at some point I'll get round to I might have another go at writing a blog, and I might reinvigorate my Blue Sky account.
Oh, there you go. So please do go back to writing blogs. I really found them really, really interesting. So yeah.
Thanks, Marcus. That's really kind of you. It's really nice of you to say.
It's true. At least you have an audience of n=1. So there you go.
But like we said earlier, you only need 10 people rather than 100,000.
You just need to find another 9 to justify your time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing your work, how it progresses, and how it shapes into building these AI tools that will have an impact. Definitely. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me down. It's been really good fun. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks again, Marcus. Thanks.